Today's daf is daf Yud Gimel, and yesterday we got up to Omer Le, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Rabbi Yirmiyah, 8th line down from the top. What we have to know is that the Gemara established a principle that any tvua that was harvested Sukkot time for sure belongs to the previous year before Rosh Hashana, because we have to assume that if you're ready to harvest the fruit, that means it's fully developed by Sukkot, it would have already reached a certain level of its development before Rosh Hashana, belonging therefore to the previous year. And that level is called Havah Shlish, which is going to be the main primary topic of today's discussion. Amalei, so Rabbi Yirmiyah turns to Rabbi Zera, having established this principle that the Rabbanon know for sure that any tvua that was harvested Sukkot time would certainly have reached Havah Shlish before Rosh Hashanah. The Kimlu l'Rabbanon bein Shlish lepachos mishlish. Are the Chachamim such experts that they would know meticulously and accurately about the growth of grains to such an extent that they know that any tvua that is fit to be harvested Sukkot time certainly reached Havah Shlish before Rosh Hashanah? And this kind of a question is typical of Rabbi Yirmiyah. The Gemara tells us in Masechet Baba Basra that Rabbi Yirmiyah asked a similar question, and they asked him to leave the Beis Medrash because he was placing a certain shadow of a doubt about the reliability of the Chachamim. Amalei. So Rabbi Zera responded in a pretty serious way, a harsh way, and he says to him, Lav haminilcha, didn't I already tell you in the past? You have a record. Lo tepak nafshach lebar mi hilchasa. Don't take yourself out of the realm of halacha to question those shiurim that the Chachamim established. And as I said before, this is based on a Gemara Baba Basra Daf Chav Gimel and Beis, where Rabbi Yirmiyah asks a similar question and they threw him out of the Beis Medrash. So Rabbi Zera says, look, if you're going to keep asking questions like this, they're going to have to take you out of the Beis Medrash, give you a boot. And now Rabbi Zera wants to demonstrate to Rabbi Yirmiyah how meticulous the Chachamim are about shiurim, and they're exact. Kol midos Chachamim kenhu. I'm going to give you a list of midos that the Chachamim established, and they're all exact, bit simtzum. For example, mikvah. A tamei has to be tovel in a mikvah, and the mikvah has to have a minimum of 40 sa, exactly 40 sa of mayim hu tovel. And this the Gemara bases on the fact that the Torah says v'rachatz b'mayim es kol b'saro, and the Gemara Chagig on Daf Yud Aleph says that he has to be tovel in mayim that have enough to cover an entire guf of a person in one dunking. And the Chachamim say that that's called Ama al Ama begova sholosh amos. That's the average size of a person, height of a person. And the Chachamim calculated that that's exactly equivalent to 40 sa. A sa is 24 lugim. And if, for example, Bi'arbaim saw, if this mikveh was missing a kurtav. Now watch this. A kurtav is 1/64 of a lug. And we said that a sa'a is equivalent to 24 lugim. And there are 40 sa in a mikveh. If you make the calculation, a quart of is 1 over Shishim v'echad elef arba meos v'arboim. It's 1 over 61,440 of the share of a mikvah. And if that little tipa ketana, that one drop of a kurtav is missing from the mikvah, then also lo tfiloso. It's possible. It's not a kosher mikvah. And eino yochel litbal b'hem. So even though the amount of water that's missing from this mikvah is relatively minuscule, as we said before, it's a sheer katan miod, nevertheless, it passes the mikvah. Says Rabbi Zera, let me give you another example of how precise the measurements are that the Chacham established. And now we go on to Tumas Ochlin. The Torah says that Ochlin umashkin are makabel tuma. However, midrabanan, we say that an ochel could be metami another ochel. What's the shear of an ochel for Kabbalah's tuma? And the answer is kibeta. It's metame if it's kibeta, and then it can convey tuma to another ochel. That's called tumas ochel. So we see that the Chachamim were mishayer a kibeta. Now, how did they come up with a kibeta? Torah says in Vayikra Yud Aleph, "V'chol kli cheres asher yipol mehem el tocho, kol asher b'socho yitma, v'oso tishveru, mikol ha'ochel asher ye'ochel." And why did the Torah add these words, mikol ochel asher ye'ochel? The Gemara interprets it in Masechet Yoma on Daf A, shal ochel metame es ha'ochlin, if it's an ochel she'efshar li'ochlo b'vasachas. And the Chachamim estimated that the average beis habliyah of a person can hold a shear of a beitzas tarnagolas, exactly a shear of a beitzas tarnagolas. But kabeitzah chaser shumchum, a little sesame seed, eino metami tumas ochlin. Here we have a very famous machlokas rishonim. What does that mean, eino metami tumas ochlin? According to most Rishonim, it means it cannot convey Tumah if it's so small, but it can receive Tumah. But there are Rishonim, possibly Rashi, the Biri quotes others, who maintain that it cannot even receive Tumah. It's not susceptible to Tumah if it's missing a shumshum's worth of a kibetza. Here's a third example. And now we get to something called Tumas Medris. A zav or a zavo or a yoledes that placed their weight on top of an object. That's called medris. Any kelim that are underneath that object become tameh, even if there are things that are mafsik between him and that kelim. For example, he's got stones, but underneath the stones are a kelim. Everything contracts tumah, and that's called tumas medris. And the Rambam paskins in Hilchas Mishkav Umoshav that it's a tumah bein aminiyah kovdon al yidesha amdu olav, where they stood on top of this, or shachvu, or they rested on top of it, or sheyashvu, or they sat. And the Rambam goes on, tells you all the different scenarios of tumas medris. And the Chachamim say that the shear for tumas medris, in the case of a beged that's 3 tfachim on 3 tfachim, and the zav or the zav, the lettuce sat on top of this beged, the beged has only 3 tfachim by 3 tfachim. It's a relatively small patch of cloth, but nevertheless, mitame medrus, it becomes susceptible to tumas medrus. But let's say it was shlosha tfachim al shlosha tfachim chaser nima achas, it was missing one thread. It's minus sholosh al sholosh tfachim by one thread. Eina metami medrus. So we see that the Chachamim are very precise in that shear, and therefore, when it comes to the shear of shlish betvua to generate a chiyuv maser, likewise they are very precise. Now at this point, Rabbi Yirmiyah retracts his original question because he finds a source to prove that the Chachamim were experts in evaluating, estimating Havah Shlish. Hadar Omar Abirmi changed his mind, and he said, La Milsahi the Amri, the question that I had raised is not a question at all. Chavraya refers to the students in the yeshiva, and they raised the question, Meirav Kahana, Omer Shekrivi Yisrael B'Knisasim La'aretz, at the time that Yoshua crossed the Jordan and entered into the land of Israel, which was on the 10th of Nisan, and now, just 6 days later, they brought the Omer. Where did they get barley in order to be makriv the Omer and to be matir all the chadash and make it into Yashan on the 16th of Nisan? It's not possible that from the 10th of Nisan, when they entered into the land, they would have the time to plant and to harvest siorim barley in that short amount of 6 days. V'im Tomer, and you'll ask me, the Ayel Biad Nachri, they just simply took barley that was growing in the fields of the 7 nations that occupied Palestine, and that means that it would have the status of Eretz Yisrael even before the Jewish people entered into the land. That's impossible. The Torah says, "Va'avesem es ha'omer reishis k'tzir chem." K'tzir chem means it's your k'tzir. Amar Achmona. The Torah is saying that the precondition for the Karba Minchas Omer brought on the 16th of Nisan is got to be k'tzir chem v'lo k'tzir nachri, not some barley that was grown in the fields of a guy. And again, we go back to that question. From whence did they have barley to bring the Omer? So the Gemara says, what kind of question is that? And the Gemara sort of cuts off Rabbi Yirmiyah right in the middle, and they say, maybe they couldn't grow Omer, and therefore they didn't bring the Omer in that first year. So the Gemara says, Lo sal kedait. That's not a havamid. For sure, they brought the Omer. If we just read Yoshua, we'll see the Chsiv, regard to that first year, when Bnei Yisrael entered into the land, the Tanakh testifies, Vayochlu me'avur. The word me'avur means from the Tvua ha'aretz, mimachras ha'pesach. Mimachras ha'pesach means on the 16th of Nisan, which is the day beyond the first day of Rosh of Pesach, which is on the 15th to the 16th. What's the diuk here? Mimachras ha'pesach achol, but me'ikara lo achol. In other words, they only ate from the Tvuas Ha'aretz beginning with the 16th of Nisan. They did not eat from the Tvuas Ha'aretz before the 16th of Nisan. Why not? And the only answer could be is they had to wait until they could bring the Omer so that all the Tvua would now be Nitar al Yidei Akrovas HaOmer, because the Omer is Matir Chadash, the Akrivu Omer for Hadar Achle. So we see clearly that even on the very first day, the very first year that they arrived in Eretz Yisrael, they brought the Omer. How could they have brought the Omer? Where did they have Tvua that would have been planted and harvested by Bnei Yisrael? K'tzir chem, me'hechan ekrivu. Amolahen, when the Bnei Yeshiva raised this question to Rav Kahana, he responded that, you know what? They used siorim that grew biyad nachri, and it's not considered k'tzir nachri. Why is that so? Because they entered into the land, they found barley that had not yet reached the level of havah shlish. The kol shelo hevi shlish biyad nachri, it's not considered k'tzir nachri if it didn't reach the development level of shlish biyad nachri. So we don't exclude something from the Omer because it was planted by goyim. That doesn't make it k'tzir nachri. K'tzir nachri means it grew under the planting, etc., of the nachri. But here, the nachri it didn't even reach the shlish. So now we see that Bnei Yisrael knew exactly when it's called Havah Shlish. They could look at the Omer, at the Bali of Eretz Yisrael, and they see that the Bali didn't reach Shlish, and therefore it's only going to reach Shlish in the period of time after Bnei Yisrael enter into Eretz Yisrael from the 10th until the 16th. So now Rabbi Yomi is going to explain his proof that the Chachamim are experts in the tiv, in the nature of the biology, so to speak, the botany of Tfuah. They know exactly when it's shlish. And how so? Because the Dilma Ayel Velo Kimlu, if you're going to tell me that maybe the Tfuah reached shlish biyad Nochri, and that disqualifies it for the Minchas HaOmer, and the Chachamim are not Bekiyim, they're not experts in determining shlish, maybe it reached shlish, and therefore it's disqualified for the Omer. How could they be absolutely convinced that it didn't reach shlish biyad Nochri, and therefore Tzir Yisrael and not Tzir Nochri, unless they were absolute experts in evaluating shlish? Ella, we must conclude, therefore, says Rabbi Yirmiyah, Kimlahu, they knew exactly what's less than shlish, and they knew exactly what's more than shlish. Hachinami here too, with regard to Tfuah that was harvested on Chagas Sukkos, we know for sure the Rabbanan Kimlu that it already had reached shlish before Rosh Hashana 2 weeks earlier, and therefore belongs to the previous year. And that's why Rabbi Yomi rescinded, he withdrew his original question. So now the Gemara deflects his proof. The Dilma, who have no proof because perhaps when they entered into the land of Israel and they investigated the Tfuah, Lo Ayel Klal, they found that there was Tfuah that didn't begin its process of maturation. Hecha the Ayel River, or alternatively, they could tell that it was only at the beginning of its development. Maybe it reached a quarter of its development. And Bein Shlish L'Pachas L'Shlo Kimle, but they cannot tell you whether it's before Shlish or after Shlish. That exact it can't be. That Bekiyas, that expertise they don't have. What they can tell you, if it's very, very early in its development, it's just beginning to develop, it didn't even reach a Revia, then they could know that it reached Shlish. Gemara says, Lo Sal Kedai. You cannot entertain the possibility that they took Tvuah that hadn't even grown at all when they came into Eretz Yisrael. It was before its growth. The pasuk says in Yoshua, "V'ha'am olu b'nei Yarden, esar lachodesh harishon." Chodesh Rishon is Nisan. So they came out of the Jordan River on the 10th of Nisan, and that's when they entered into the land. And now what do? They found barley that hadn't even developed yet, and they brought it for the Omer 6 days later. Visal kedai techlo ayel klal. If you're going to tell me that the Omer that they took had not grown at all biyad Nochri, if it's not K'tzir Nochri. So on the 10th of Nisan, they saw something that didn't develop. His Bechamisha Yomi, from the 10th, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days later to the 16th, is Mika Malia? Is it possible that it filled out, meaning it grew? How could something that barley that hadn't even started its growth complete its growth within such a short period of time? It's impossible. Elamai, the Gemara says, you want to say the Isle River Odanka and Akati Chabicha Yomi Mika Malia? You're asking that when they entered into the land of Israel, it hadn't even reached a quarter of its development or a sixth of its development, which is called a Danka. And you're bothered by the question, how could it be that 5 days later it was completely developed? Elamai Islam Meimar, I have a solution to this problem, because in two places in Tanakh, in Sefer Yirmiyah and in Sefer Daniel, the land of Israel is called Eretz HaTzvi. Tzvi represents the fastest animal. And what's quick about Eretz Yisrael? It could develop fruit and vegetables very, very quickly. It's a miraculous land. Eretz Tzvi Ksiv Bey, and just like a tzvi runs very fast, so too Eretz Yisrael is memaheres levashal es peroseh, and therefore it's possible that within this 5-day period of time it reached shlish. Is hachinami here too? When we say that when they entered into the land, the tfuah was not grown at all, we could say Eretz Tzvi too, and maybe it actually sped up the process of development, and therefore it reached the level of shlish. Now, earlier, the Gemara said that tfuah depends upon shlish, and that's derived from a pasuk in the 23rd chapter of Shmos, V'chag ha'asif, b'tzeis Hashana, b'aspecha es ma'asecha min hasadeh. And we had learned earlier that the words Chag ha'asif are totally redundant because it says bi'aspecha. So why do you have to say Chag ha'asif bi'aspecha? It's just repetitious. And therefore we use the word asif, miloshen ktsira, when you gather or you harvest. And the Gemara raises the following objection. Maskifla Rav Chanina, umi motzes amrit, ahai asif ktsirhu. Can you really tell me that the word asif means ktsir, and therefore when it says chag ktsir, it's redundant? For the drasha of lashon ktsira maksiv, the Torah says in Parshas Re'eh in Sefer Dvarim, legabi chag hasukos, it says chag hasukos te'aseh lechashiv es yomim bi'aspecha migarnecha mikvech v'yomar mar. And Rabbi Yochanan in Masechet Sukkah on Daf Yud Beis Darshans, Bipsoles Goren V'Yekev HaKosav V'Daber. The subject of the word bi'aspecha is the schach. To teach me what qualifies as schach. It's got to be similar to garnecha and yikvecha. And that's called psoles goren v'yekev. It's got to be something that grows from the ground, and it's not makabel tuma. So therefore, when it says in the Torah chag asif, that's not redundant. You can't use it to darshan lashon ktsira. That's the name of the chag. The chag is chag asif. And asif is a reference to the sukkah, which means the asif of the aspecha mi psoles goren v'yeket. That's what you can use, and that what qualifies going to Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation of this pasuk for schach. So it's as if the Torah had said, Chag HaSukkos taselecha b'tzeis Hashana bizman aspechas tvua min hasadeh. There's no source whatsoever from here that the tfuah, which is cut down on sukkahs, belongs to the previous year. We thought we understood that from this pasuk Chag HaSif we could derive the conclusion of Havah Shlish. But also Rabbi Chanina v'shada by narga. Came Rabbi Chanina and he completely cut it down. He undermined our drush. We're going to have to find an alternative source for Havas Shlish. Now, the phrase Shida by Narga literally translates that he took an axe and he cut it down, meaning he gave us an answer and we can't refute it. Elami Nolan. So from whence then do we derive that tfuah depends upon Havas Shlish? Kidisanya, we learned in a brayser, Rabbi Yonasan ben Yosef Omer, he's referring to the Shnas HaShmita. At the end of Sefer Vayikra, it says that when Bnei Yisrael will come and claim, how can we observe the Shemitah? What are we going to eat on the 7th year? Lo nizra, v'lo nesaf es tfuasenu. What are we going to do on the 8th year? And the Torah says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu responds, v'tzivisi es birchasi, v'asas es hatvua l'shalosh shanim. I'm going to bestow a bracha, and the tefua that grows on the 6th year will be such a voluminous amount of tefua that's going to last for the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th year for 3 full years.